Today we'll be looking at modern Native American sovereignty, indigenous rights from the late 1800s to the late 1900s. We want to identify key legal texts and doctrine for Native American affairs, examine challenges to indigenous sovereignty in the United States, and describe the perseverance of Native rights. To begin, U.S. Native policy is an ever-evolving, ever-changing policy. It's always adapted. It's always changed based on circumstances more than anything else. You could almost even say that Native policy in the United States has usually been patchwork. So a lot of dependency on U.S. power and aims. If we take a look at the Revolutionary War era, this was a time when the United States of America was small, it was divided, it was weak, its economy was struggling. So usually during the American Revolutionary War and all the way up until the War of 1812, the United States of America always had this major threat, if you will, and that was the British up here in Canada. It was the Hudson Bay Company that was active all the way out here, and their agents that could easily turn Native American nations against the United States. You had the Spanish up here in Texas. Their aims, of course, were contrary to U.S. policies of expansion. And then you add to that the French, who were nominally our allies, but following the American Revolutionary War, they descended into the French Revolution. So they were out there on the seas, the Atlantic Ocean, challenging our maritime neutrality. So the United States in this time period, it's basically surrounded. It's trying to develop internal improvements, roads, bridges, ports, etc. It's got an economy that it's just, it's simply getting, working hard to try to get its rights recognized abroad, to be able to trade their wares in places like the Netherlands and France and Great Britain and Russia, all these countries that were pretty much closed off because, mercantilism was still a major economic policy there. So during this time period, what was American interest? Well, American interests were basically to, on the one hand, they were going through with the Iroquois up here in the northern American states and punishing them because they sided against the United States during the Revolutionary War. They were following similar policies, down here in the southeastern states, but at the same time, they were trying to do this juggling act to lure Native American trade to the United States of America, here in the Ohio River Valley and the Mississippi River Valley. They were trying to keep them also neutral and basically not hostile to American settlements and interests. But what happens after 1812 is that the United States of America, they no longer really have to worry about the British up here anymore. That war took care of, British interest in reasserting their power over the United States. They didn't have to really worry about the French out here anymore either. The only real challenge they had were the Spanish, and the Spanish were pretty much contained down here in Texas. And so what's going to happen after 1812 is their policy is going to shift. So instead of just trying to, keep Native Americans neutral, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to start to focus really on expansion. This is going to be the time period where they're looking towards removal. And we'll get into that in a minute. But the Native Americans, what are they doing in this time period? Well, they're responding to these ever-changing political and cultural realities also. Prior to the 7 Years' War, the Native Americans, they had a different political reality. They had the French up here in Canada that they could use to balance off, Spanish interest, which were still down here in this region. I guess we already got those markers there. And then they could use those to balance even further against the British settlements out here in the east. Uh, Following the American 7 years, following the 7 Years' War, though, they no longer had the French up there. Following the American Revolutionary War, they no longer had the British over there, especially after 1812. So how are they responding? Well, they're following kind of a different approaches. Also, there's native accommodation. So there will be some tribes, some nations that are going to adopt elements of U.S. culture, for example. They'll accept missionaries. They'll accept, some of these changing gender roles. They'll begin to have religious beliefs that will merge Christianity and indigenous beliefs to create um, uh, syncretized or syncretic religions like the Longhouse religion. They'll try to seek out new niches in this new economic system. Doing traditional crafts like basket weaving in a way that lures or opens up these products to American markets, or by providing manual labor. Down in the southwestern nations, they're going to largely, kind of, really acculturate to American society. So you have the Cherokee and other southeastern tribes, for example, that will adopt American forms of agriculture, American forms of architecture, uh, American literature in the sense of, creating an alphabet for their language, even adopting the Southern slavery or Southern system of slavery for their agricultural purposes, all while retaining, their native language, many of their native customs. At the same time, there is resistance, though. They will continue to resist. So, starting, immediately after the 7 Years' War, you had Pontiac's Rebellion. Following the American Revolutionary War, Little Turtle is going to lead a confederation headed by the Miamis to try to halt American expansion from 1780s to 1790s. Tecumseh is going to lead the last major armed resistance against American encroachment, though, during the War of 1812, when he brings together a coalition stretching all the way down the Mississippi River Valley, but really kind of anchored among the Shawnee, among his people, in an attempt to stop American expansion westward. But he's defeated and killed during the closing years of the War of 1812. And so that's going to end in that resistance also, and really going to end much of the Native American armed resistance east of the Mississippi River following 1812. So what basically happens after 1812? Well, the United States of America enters into a new period. They still have sectional divisions. You have the northern states versus, the free labor northern states versus the southern, slave societies. And then you have the western states with their kind of mixed interests that, culturally, many of their settlers, come from the southern states. They have that connection there. They're more agricultural than industrial. So that, again, puts that connection with the South. But at the same time, they need protection for some of the goods that they're making. They need in federal investments in roads and bridges and canals to link their economies to the Eastern Board. And so that interest in internal affairs and their willingness to negotiate and compromise on tariff issues, that's going to link them, in with the northern states. So you do have these divisions, but overall, the United States of America is growing after the War of 1812. They are developing industry. They are expanding in population. They're expanding in wealth. They are adapting the new technologies found in Europe, like the railroad and the steamboat, applying these to the development of textile mills. In such a way that they're becoming strong enough to where they're able to stand on their own 2 feet in this very kind of hostile world. And so this is going to reflect really kind of their approach. So if we take a look at 1803 and um, Thomas Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase. Why did Thomas Jefferson purchase Louisiana? Well, he envisioned it, all of this territory right here, as a future quote unquote Indian territory as he saw it. Um, but this is not going to last very long. And so what we're going to see is American expansion is going to hit full force following the War of 1812. And instead of trying to maintain this balance with Native Americans to at least keep them, kind of off to the sideline while the United States faces the British and French and the Spanish, following the War of 1812, they become very aggressive. So this enters into the period of Indian removal, the 1820s. This aggressive approach basically sought to remove all native peoples of lands east of the Mississippi River Valley. And it's really going to be embraced by the southern states that are seeing a lot of expansion, as well as the Jackson administration. And so this is the time period where we have this mass push of tribes in this direction. Now, while Native American sovereignty east of the Mississippi River is being assaulted, it's going to be kind of, there's going to be a lot of bad that is going to develop from this situation, but there will be some seeds sown that in the long run are going to help Native Americans maintain their sovereignty or pieces of sovereignty within the United States of America. So if we look at Indian removal, again, it was really pushed by President Andrew Jackson. He and states like Georgia were adamant that the Native Americans had to go, and President Andrew Jackson was not beyond using trickery, deceit, the threat of force to get Native Americans in this part of the country to sign treaties. And he was up against Native leaders like Chief John Ross, who were adamantly opposed to taking his people west across the Mississippi to foreign lands. The Cherokee and Choctaw, Chickasaw, the Seminole, many of these, the Creek, they wanted to stay in their homelands. And so the Cherokee, for example, they launched this, major PR campaign with the American people. They send memorials and petitions to Congress, outlining the unethical or the immorality behind the policy of trying to force them westward. They're publishing what we would call today editorials and newspapers, trying to rally support among the American population, and this eventually ends up before the Supreme Court. And what happens is in the Supreme Court there were two cases that were ruled on: Cherokee Nation versus Georgia of 1831 and Worcester versus Georgia of 1832. And what happens here is the court under Chief Justice John Marshall rules that in the first one, in Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, that Native Americans had a special status. They were, as he said, domestic dependent nations. And as such, there were elements of sovereignty that they retained from, the pre-contact, their pre-contact status. So, this idea that they have certain sovereignty. On the one hand, yes, are they under the authority of the United States? Well, the Marshall Court's basically ruling yes, they are within American boundaries, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that they gave up all their rights because American borders, expanded over them. So now that didn't completely end the assaults on native sovereignty for the Cherokee. After American missionaries are arrested on Cherokee land, another case comes before the Supreme Court in Worcester versus Georgia of 1832. And in this case, basically what the Supreme Court did is that it stated that their status nullified any state authority over First Nations. So the states didn't have control over Native Americans. It was, there was this, there wasn't really a state-native relationship that, had to be considered. The nations only really had to treat with the federal government because of their sovereign status. Now, ultimately, this did not stop the process of removal. What Jackson's administration basically does is they send out agents to many of the different tribes in this area, and then they would go and they would, if they were rebuffed by the tribe as a whole, then these agents would go in and they would sign a treaty with, like, sympathetic leaders of the different tribes. And this leads to a lot of internal fighting within the native peoples. Leads to the assassination of leaders like John Ridge, and it's going to be a civil strife that's going to follow some of these tribes to the west, and it's going to break out some really nasty fighting during the American Civil War. So ultimately, what happens is the Cherokee are going to end up being pushed west, following the other southeastern tribes on the Trail of Tears. They'll end up losing about a quarter of their population in the process. And then the only remaining tribe will basically be the Seminole down here in Florida. And it's going to take the United States of America fighting a series of wars against this tribe that, when you actually compare the cost in terms of wealth that the United States is going to have to expend just to force the Seminole west. I mean, some Native American historians that focus on this war, relate it to really kind of be the very first American Vietnam War, because ultimately the United States loses, but it still declares victory, even though it loses the conflict. Cost them a lot in terms of casualties, in terms of wealth, for what is really a defeat. Now, if we go back to Jefferson, when Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory, he purchased it from, Napoleon Bonaparte's revolutionary French government in 1803 for a bargain price. And Jefferson, what was it that he wanted out of the purchase? The one thing that the Americans wanted is, what they definitely wanted access to the mouth of the Mississippi. They wanted to be able to control access to it. There was also an interest in these western lands. Thomas Jefferson bought into the concept that many of the founding generation bought into, which was that the United States was building an empire of liberty, in which their democratic institutions would spread westward all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But for the foreseeable future, Jefferson did not believe that Americans would be able to populate that much land in a short period of time. He thought it was going to be generations. So when he authorized the purchase, what he thought he was kind of creating here was what he called Indian Territory or Indian Country. So he believed that the United States would basically push Native Americans west across the Mississippi, and there they would have all of this time to assimilate Native Americans to American economic systems, production methods, culture, language, education, etc., so that when the United States of America did expand westward into these territories, the Native Americans would be able to adjust to it. But this did not work the way Jefferson imagined. In fact, it didn't take generations. It didn't even take, the end of his generation for the United States to expand in there. So Jefferson, he dies 1826. By 1826, what has already happened in this part of the country? Well, Missouri has been admitted to the Union following the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Louisiana preceded that by 8 years. They were admitted in 1812. Then you have other developments. First off, out here in this strip of territory that the British and the United States called Oregon Country, you had American and British captains that had been visiting this part of the West Coast for since the late 1700s, and they reported on the presence of sea otters and other not only maritime but also or marine, but not only marine but also land fur-bearing animals that were of high value. You had a number of fur trading companies from Canada as well as from the United States that were sending traders and trappers out into these lands, trying to get these pelts for market back in Europe. And so in the 1820s, shortly after the Missouri Compromise, what's happening back in the United States is there's now this push for migration to Oregon Country. And by the 1830s, the very first trains or wagon trains are going to start making their way west overland across the Rocky Mountains and Native American territory to this part of the world. And Native Americans are already starting to get a taste of what's to come. On the one hand, they're getting access to the trade goods from the East and the West, and this is bringing in new tools, new implements, new clothing, new weaponry, horses, all this stuff to that's having an impact on their day-to-day lives. In some cases making it, in many cases making some things easier using these metal instruments, but at the same time it is creating something to be worried about in the fact that they are losing some of this knowledge. They're not becoming trade dependent, but when you can buy arrowheads that are superior because they're made out of iron, why make them? So that trade though is having that impact. And at the same time, what's happening is as these trails, these wagon trains are going overland, they're consuming a lot of the resources along rivers and along places that Native Americans migrate to because they're resource rich, and this is affecting their ability to feed their own horse herds, to collect firewood, to gather food and other the resources that they need. So the writing's on the wall, if you will. And it's not just simply Oregon Country. You have, in addition to Oregon Country, 1847. You're going to have Brigham Young lead his very first pioneer band overland to what becomes known as Utah Territory. And once the Mormons establish themselves in the great Salt Lake City, they're going to start to create this Mormon corridor stretching down to California and into northern Mexico. They're living, among the Paiute and the Shoshone and the Ute up here in this portion of modern-day Utah. But they're making connections down here among other Native people and among Spanish settlements, and their settlements are starting to branch out throughout that whole region. 1820s, the Americans are going to begin to make their expansion here into Texas with the old 300. The very first settlements, down in this part of the world are coming in contact with the Apache here, the Ute, the Caddo, the Wichita, the Comanche. This whole system, this whole cultural connected system that links all these tribes and Spanish settlements here along the Red River in this part of central New Mexico. You have, in addition to Texas, 1849, 1859, gold rushes, starting here in California and then expanding here in Denver. And so really, this idea that Jefferson had that this is going to be a territory for the Native Americans for generations, that they'll be able to slowly adjust to the American expansion, by the time he dies, it's already, being breached in multiple points. And within, one generation after, he passes, it's, as you can see here, it's being cracked open and Native peoples there are having to adjust. So what basically happens to native sovereignty in the mid 1800s as well? It's going to come under, it's going to face a number of different challenges. During the American Civil War, you had the United States government focusing most of its attention east. You had the Army of the Potomac versus the Army of Northern Virginia that was capturing all the headline news. You had the Lincoln administration trying to force the Confederated States back into the Union. But that doesn't mean that events in the West stood still. You still had during this time period people moving west, new settlements being built. You still had in this part of the country Native Americans acting and reacting and adjusting to the presence of these new settlements and wagon trains in their territory, especially down here in Colorado. Colorado, you had the gold rush that centered at Pikes Peak, began in the late 1850s. 1859, they had a full-fledged gold rush happening. And what's going on is you have all these people taking the Oregon Trail and just pouring over into this territory, and they were encroaching on Arapaho and Cheyenne and Sioux territory. And so you start to see some conflicts as Native peoples are trying to fight against these wagon trains and preserve their resources. And it really kind of comes to a head in eastern Colorado in 1864 with the Sand Creek Massacre, in which Colonel Chivington and his Colorado militia basically attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment and massacred women and children. And after this, after news starts trickling back to the east, a congressional committee known as the Doolittle Committee is established, and they go out and they investigate, what's going on in the West. Why are the Sioux, why are the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, attacking American wagon trains and settlements out there? And they find out that, there's been a lot of abuse at the hands of the settlers. And so this begins to mark a change in the approach that the United States government's going to take to settlement. So once the American Civil War ended, and after the Johnson administration leaves office and Reconstruction is put on path that the radical Republicans desire, we have a new administration that comes in. This is the administration under Ulysses S. Grant. And Ulysses S. Grant is somewhat sympathetic to Native Americans, largely we believe because of Eli Parker, who is a member of his administration and a Native American. And what the Grant administration wants to do is, it's not that they want to abandon assimilation policies, but they want to cut back on some of the abuses within the American Native American system that's causing conflict in the West. And so what they come up with is termed the peace policy. And the idea behind the peace policy was that they established a board of Indian commissioners, and the board of Indian commissioners was responsible for overseeing like the establishment of treaties, but also it was going to get rid of like basically the spoil system within the reservation system. So Indian agents were no longer going to be political cronies. Instead, what they were going to do is they were going to turn over day-to-day administration of Native American affairs to religious organizations. So the Quakers, the Episcopalians, the Catholics, a number of these different religious groups, because they believed that they would be less inclined to cheat Native Americans out of their treaty rights. So the idea becomes peace on the reservation, war off. So it was a peace policy so long as the Native Americans agreed to go to the reservations. And the term that becomes real famous during this peace policy in this time period was basically to kill the Indian to save the man. On the reservations, it was not going to be a peaceful process necessarily. Today, it would be classified under genocide, according to our modern understanding of that term. Because on the reservations, what's happening is they're trying to erase Native American culture. Native Americans are going to be pressured to adopt American agriculture, American learning, and then ultimately, what does the United States government want? Well, it wants them to settle down on individual allotments of land. So as the 1870s and 1880s progress, there will be continued challenges to Native sovereignty. So a good example of this is in 1871, the federal government unilaterally says, okay, the treaty making process is now ending. We're no longer going to go out and treat with one tribe after another, and try to negotiate out terms for them to surrender land. We're basically going to dictate this is the land you get, and these are the rights that you have, and these are the goods that we're going to give you in exchange for it. Going into the 1870s, education is going to be used to assault Native American culture in the forms of boarding schools. So we oftentimes view the opening of the Carlisle boarding school in Pennsylvania by Captain Richard Henry Pratt as like really the beginning of this process, where basically Native Americans are taken off of the immediate reservation and then sent either east or sent just elsewhere within the territory or state. And here they are basically, what usually happens to them when they go into the reservation, the boarding school. First thing that the educators do is they have them cut their hair. They have them take off their Native American clothing and dress in Western or American clothing. Luther Standing Bear, for example, remembers being sent up to a chalkboard and told to choose a name, and so he points to, he can't read English at the time, doesn't know really what's going on. He's a little kid, and so he points at one of the names, and his first name becomes Luther, and he keeps his dad's name, Standing Bear is his last name. And so you're going to end up having a generation of Native Americans, like Luther Standing Bear, Susan and Suzette LaFlesche, and others, Charles Eastman, Carlos Montezuma, that are going to be born in this and educated in this system. And so on the one hand, they'll have memories of the reservation, how their parents and their grandparents lived, the stories that they told, but at the same time, they'll have this other foot in the American culture that the boarding school introduced them to. Coming in behind that, with the treaty process ending, with boarding schools and the peace policy, comes the real assault on Native sovereignty. 1887, all this territory out here has been reserved, made into reservations. And what Congress seeks to do with the Dawes Act is to further break up these territories into family allotments. So the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act, basically said, okay, we're going to give 160 acres to the heads of families. And they can either willingly do this and go out and select their own lands, or if they refuse to, then we're just going to simply have the Indian agents go out there and assign them lands. And then the government basically holds the title for 25 years. They granted citizenship to Indians who participated in it. But then here's the kicker: is they turn around and they open up surplus land to the general market. So this is the real kind of big thing: is taking, say, Choctaw territory here, breaking it up into these little allotments of homes, and then taking all this other territory and then opening it up to American settlers. Now, following behind that, in 1898, you had the Curtis Act, which terminated native governments in Indian Territory. And the big push behind this was that Congress is getting ready to open up this territory to settlement which they then turned into the state of Oklahoma in 1907. So there's a lot happening in this time period, but at the same time, and I misspelled sovereignty up there, my apologies. There is, once again, more seeds being sown that will help, preserve native sovereignty. So first off, in the eastern states, there's a growing interest in Native American affairs. 1881, Helen Hunt Jackson published A Century of Dishonor that goes through, and it's kind of like this example of the muckraking journalism that's becoming popular in the late 1800s and the Gilded Age. And she outlines all of the unethical treatment that Native Americans have experienced at the hand of the federal government and American settlers. And her book is largely successful. In 1882, the Indian Rights Association forms and begins a series known as the Lake Mohonk Conferences. And what'll happen is that people that dub themselves humanitarians, you could equate them to the liberals of our modern era, they will meet at Lake Mohonk usually every year at these annual conferences, and there they'll discuss Native American affairs. And this is going to generate a lot of interest in kind of like your middle class, wealthy classes, educated classes back in the East. In addition to that, you do have this group of people that are coming up through the boarding schools that are also going to publish and do things that really attract attention to who they are and to their life stories. So you have Charles Eastman, Luther Standing Bear, Susan and Suzette LaFleche, all that were born in these two worlds, and through their writings and through their experiences make known the indigenous experience and how they're adjusting and living, and what reservation life means to them, what boarding schools mean to them. And it's from these individuals and those like them that you'll get organizations like the Society of American Indians in 1911, in which what are sometimes termed red progressives, Carlos Montezuma, Charles Eastman, Gertrude Bonin, also known as Sitka Sa, they're going to start, these are Native Americans educated within the boarding schools that are speaking out for Native American affairs, Native American rights, talking to congressmen and people of influence, and trying to get policies that preserve Native American culture and Native American values and Native American sovereignty passed through Congress and enforced by the federal government. Basically speaking up for indigenous interests. There's the National Council of American Indians. This was formed in 1926, and it's going to, the NCAI is going to be around the 1950s and 1960s, fighting termination policies. Vine Deloria Jr. served as president of the organization in the 1960s. So there's a lot happening there. Back on the reservations, what's happening? Well, you have Native Americans that, on the one hand, yes, they are acculturating to American society and culture, and they're owning their own farmlands, and they're trying to do it within their own cultural understanding. So if you go and you take a look at the reservations, there's an article, Reservation Ecositas, the Pine Ridge Indian Policy 1879-1885, written by Mark Ellis, that examined the creation and expansion of Oglala Indian Police Force at the Pine Ridge under Agent Alexander McGillicuddy. And basically, the police force replaced the traditional Akasita role in Oglala Lakota society. And this helped basically get the military off of the reservation and out of day-to-day military affairs, and put that element of maintaining the peace within the hands of the Lakota themselves. And this is something that, when you go into the 1900s, like into modern day reservations, is an important aspect of Native sovereignty, the ability to police your own communities, to enforce law through your own cultural lens. So that's an important development. So there's a lot happening here. Now, at the same time, we continue on with our Supreme Court challenges, and in the United States of America, Supreme Court, in the way that it decides things, can have major impacts on society. If you want an example of that, you can look at the modern rulings on Obergefell versus Hodges that recognize same-sex marriage. Of course, the 1970s, with Roe versus Wade and women's reproductive rights. Likewise, this is a very active time for Native Americans in the Supreme Court. So Ex parte Crow Dog, 1883, the Supreme Court, recognized that Native Americans retained limited sovereignty and that district courts had no authority over criminal acts strictly involving Native Americans. And so what happens is, following Ex parte Crow Dog, is you're going to have the United States government come back and really, focus on this as a way of eroding Native sovereignty by putting them under control of district and state courts. So 1883, for example, this is where the very first attempt to put, by Huron Price, to establish courts for Indian offenses occurs. But it's really 1885 with the Major Crimes Act passed by Congress that made murder, manslaughter, assault with intent to kill, rape, arson, burglary, and larceny by one Native American on another a federal offense. And so this brings it under federal law. And then later on, especially in the termination era, they're going to work to extend state control over Native reservations. You have United States versus Kagama in 1886. Supreme Court basically nullified Indian sovereignty in this case by recognizing congressional plenary power. And so plenary power basically means absolute power. And this is something that Congress is later going to do in the insular cases when it comes to American overseas territories. So basically, Congress, it recognizes that the government can't just go in, like, say, start committing human rights violations, but on the other hand, Congress really has unchecked power. So this is a major blow to Native American rights. And this is later turned around and bolstered by Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock in 1903. And according to John R. Wonder, a leading historian on Native American legal history, he says, and I quote, "It justified the unilateral termination of treaties. No longer might Indian nations attempt to protect themselves. No longer could any semblance of rights be claimed into the Constitution based on treaty guarantees. The key to the alienation of Indian homelands, the abrogation of treaties, had been found. New colonialism was secure. To many interested non-Indians, forced acculturation was king, and the Bill of Rights had been declared inoperative for Native Americans." So you have this kind of mixed bag at this point with Native Americans, with really kind of weight being thrown against them by the Supreme Court, especially going to the late 1880s and 1900s. But at the same time, there are some successes. So United States versus Winans, 1905, the Supreme Court did uphold Yakima rights to fish the Columbia River because, quote, treaties were not rights given to Indians, but grants of rights from Indians. And then they turn right around 3 years later in Winters versus United States and say that Indian rights to water, they upheld Indian rights to water over the doctrine of prior appropriation. Basically, what this does is prior appropriation claims that those who first appropriate water from a stream could use whatever quantity sufficient for production. If the individual did not use his full share, he basically abdicated his right to that quantity. And the Supreme Court's going to rule against this extension of prior appropriation to Indian rights. In other words, they don't relinquish their water rights because they're not using them according to American custom, they don't do that. They don't relinquish those rights. Those rights stay with them. And this is actually more important than it sounds, because in the American West, an arid region, water rights were everything. Especially when you get into the mining regions of California, where these mining companies and their massive use of water to basically strip the sides of mountains clean of everything but the ore that they're looking for, could easily, use up a river or contaminate a river, destroy a river, very easily. Water was, again, was everything, was very important. So you do have these. And so this and this, they're going to lay the foundations for modern day Native American fishing and water rights. Now, the 1920s and 30s witnessed a revival of American interest in Native American affairs. So if you read Engendered Encounters, for example, Feminism and Pueblo Cultures, Margaret D. Jacobs talks about, women, feminists, American women that were, interested in kind of living outside of this, patriarchal, male-dominated, gendered society in the East, going out to Pueblo lands, and they're experiencing what they viewed as a freedom and getting very involved in Native American art, and really kind of goes into all different aspects of it. Everything questions from like, were they enforcing their own gender roles in their involvement out there? Were they, becoming liberated? What were they doing? So really good book. But when you read it, it's a great book that introduces this, kind of gives you, the reader, a peek into the fact that, especially within the intelligentsia of the United States and the artistic community, there is kind of this revival in Native American interest. And so what happens in the 1920s? It really starts with the 1921 Burson Bill, where it tries to turn Pueblo lands over to non-natives who had claims against them. This Burson Bill doesn't really succeed. There's some other efforts in there to basically, take land out and rights out from under Native Americans. But while this is going on, you do have the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, and you also have the Merriam Report. The Merriam Report of 1928 is what's really going to help shape 1930s policy, because it notes social, economic, and health problems on reservations. And it calls for reform within the Bureau of Indian Affairs to promote economic and social advancements. So when John Delano Roosevelt's elected to president, he brings in, as the head of the BIA, the new Commissioner of Indian Affairs, John Collier. And John Collier, this is a guy that's been involved in pro-Native American organizations and, developments in Pueblo lands, etc., for most of his life. And so what he comes up with is he advocates an Indian New Deal. And at the heart of the Indian New Deal is going to be the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. And it was broad, sweeping changes. Basically, tribes would form council governments, direct education, consolidate and reverse allotment, establish a court system, levy taxes. They'd be able to contract with state governments. A number of other powers are promoted in it. What comes out of Congress, though, is the Wheeler-Howard Act that removes a lot of those provisions. But under the Wheeler-Howard Act, tribes could organize councils / local government to care for their community. They could negotiate with local and state and federal governments. They did have some veto power over, sell, lease of tribal lands. They could get information on government expenditures on their bequest, all of these things. But at the same time, it still forced them to be, to seek approval from the Secretary of the Interior and from, the federal government. So, it does all this, but it also, there are limits to the Indian Reorganization Act. It does, however, it did give them funds for vocational and trade schools. They did have greater control over civil service positions in their lands. Indian art and culture did receive protection under this. It doesn't reverse tribe allotment under the Dawes Severalty Act, but the secretary could now purchase land, water, and mineral rights for tribes, and tribal governments could receive a greater voice in the transfer sale and leasing of their native lands. Now, it's important to know that the Indian Reorganization Act did not receive overwhelming support by the Native groups. Keep in mind, Native Americans have been going to boarding schools for a while now. They've served in the military. They have their own land. So some of them, believe that Collier was trying to turn them into quote unquote blanket Indians with this. Others believe that this was communism, run amok in the Western lands. They didn't want any of that. You had other groups like the Navajo, for example, who, valued their livestock, but because of arid conditions in the West, Dust Bowl, the Great Plains, this pushed federal attempt to scientifically manage grazing lands. Especially, they lost their, the federal government went out and culled their herds. So they were still upset about that. So what ends up happening is they create this provision within the Indian Reorganization Act, within that Wheeler-Howard Act, that basically says, okay, you have to vote against this legislation, or it takes effect on your lands, and if you decide to abstain from voting against this act, then that's going to be treated like a vote in favor for this act. So basically, it required, a majority of Native Americans coming out and actually voting against it for it to fail. So needless to say, a lot of tribes were organized under this. Not all, but a number. Now, there is one exception, and that is Oklahoma. The IRA excluded tribes in Oklahoma, so they passed the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act of 1936, and this allowed them to form tribal governments, apply for funds to promote business, consolidate some land, but otherwise it was really kind of watered down version. Keep in mind, one of the big things behind that was needed for the organization of Oklahoma as a state was breaking up a lot of the reservations there, and they didn't want to reverse that with the IRA. Now, World War II. What happens in World War II? Well, Native Americans served and were highly decorated. Had a very meritorious war record. So perhaps some of the more celebrated ones, more famous of the servicemen were the Navajo code talkers. These are basically what they needed to do to be able to prevent Japanese ciphers from breaking American military codes. Is they actually borrowed from a program they really kind of pioneered in World War One. They went to see in World War One. They had some success in Europe using Native Americans speaking their indigenous language as a code, as a military code that the Germans couldn't break. And it's interesting because this ended up, really kind of spurring a lot of German interest in American Indian history and culture, especially between the wars. But going into World War II, they did this on a larger scale, and so the Navajo especially were recruited for this effort, where they used the Navajo language to relay orders, very sensitive military orders and plans of attack. So at the one hand, the federal government, had a major obligation to Native American servicemen following World War II. These are the people that, on the one hand, they did not have a history of being treated very well by the government, by federal government, state governments, local governments. They experienced a lot of prejudice, but they went out there and they served very ably. But at the same time, following World War II, there was this new Cold War situation. It was the United States of America versus Russia. So you had the United States of America with their economic system of free markets and their political system of democracy. And this was against the USSR. The USSR, which had a command economy, and they had this idea of communism. And both of these governments were promoting this around the world. So the United States was saying, hey, free markets, you get to choose what you buy, what you sell, how well you do. In democracy, you can vote, and we have a Bill of Rights and all this. And the USSR was saying, hey, in our command system, there's no rich, there's no poor. The workers control the means of production. And, within our communist system, it's the Soviets, the councils, the workers that make the decisions through the Communist Party. And so it ends this tyranny of the bourgeoisie. And then, the U.S. would counter, yeah, but, the communists, you're a dictatorship and you're a human rights violator and, you don't produce wealth and prosperity. And then what did the Russians counter that with? Oh, well, look at your racism. Look at your treatment of African Americans. Look at your treatment of Native Americans. Look at the inequalities within your system. So the United States in this new political environment was really interested in getting rid of any semblance of imperialism. So, for example, in its overseas territories of Puerto Rico, they started offering the opportunity of Puerto Ricans to become members of a commonwealth. They relabel their relationship with Puerto Rico as a commonwealth. In the Philippines, they give the Philippines basically self-government, and they turn control over to the islands to the Filipinos. Hawaii is going to become a state. They're going to work to quickly turn Micronesia, which the U.S. military had seized from the Japanese, into the Federation of Micronesian States. Of course, with the caveat that we can maintain a military presence in all these lands. And so for Native Americans, this was a big issue that they had to resolve. So what they came up with is, it started off, it was really a three-pronged policy. It was compensation, termination, and this is according to Colin Calloway. It was a three-pronged process of compensation, termination, and relocation. And it starts with the Indian Claims Commission Act of 1946. What the ICC was supposed to do supposed to do this in 10 years, it ended up taking well over 30, is they were going to go through an Indian Native American tribe that believed it had been, cheated out of lands or not giving all of its, its treaty allocations, could go in and can file at the ICC, and the ICC would do a final ruling. Whatever the ICC ruled stuck, and the case could no longer be brought back up. It was a way of just dealing once and for all with any of these charges against the federal government. And what's usually going to happen, though, under the ICC is, instead of really rectifying past abuses and broken treaty obligations, they're just going to try to make the situation go away at the lowest possible cost. Coming in behind that, Congress is going to promote a new program known as termination, which is really going to take off in the 1950s. So 1950, for example, Dillon S. Meyer becomes Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and this is the guy that had overseen the Japanese American concentration camps, internment camps. So, it's a guy that's not necessarily sympathetic to ethnic minorities within the United States of America. His history of constitutional violations. In Congress, they turn around the House of Representatives and they pass House Concurrent Resolution 108. And what this does is says, okay, we are going to terminate the federal relationship with the Menominee, the Klamath, the Flathead, and other tribes. And this is followed up 2 weeks later by PL 280, Public Law 280, which transferred jurisdiction of tribal lands to state and local governments in California, Oregon, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. So the idea here is, okay, ICC compensates for past abuses. Then termination is going to close down the reservation and turn all Native Americans into landowners. And if there's a reservation business, like the Menominee had with timber, that's going to be privatized as well. And then the idea is that they wanted to actually take some of the Native Americans from these reservations and relocate them to major cities where they would be fully assimilated within the American population. So like Los Angeles and Dallas, Texas, for example, are two cities that they're going to be sent to. And this is actually resisted by Native Americans throughout the United States of America. So the National Congress of American Indians, the NCIA, is going to fight against termination. This will be the beginning of activists like Ada Deer, a Menominee, who's going to continue to fight for, restoration of Menominee and Klamath lands. But in addition to that, there's going to be an unforeseen impact of termination. What happens is you end up with groups of Native Americans that are referred to as, urban Indians. There's Native Americans that, once, yes, they may have been isolated out there on these reservations. By isolated, I mean isolated from, other Native American groups. But all these different groups being forced into these urban centers now come in contact with each other, and they start talking about their own experiences. And it's coinciding with the birth in the 1950s of the full-fledged 1960s civil rights movement. So what happens in these cities? Well, we start to get new groups like the National Indian Youth Council of 1961. You get the American Indian movement that's born in this same atmosphere. And they start to get involved with protest activities like the Alcatraz occupation of 1969. The American Indian movement, it's really going to bring to light how Native Americans are having to, what they're having to deal with when it comes to the federal government and state governments when, with Wounded Knee 2, where an Ogallala, kind of intra-Ogallala dispute breaks out into armed conflict that then, gets involved with the federal government and in a standoff between federal law enforcement agencies and AIM. And all of this is eventually going to coalesce in what's known as the Indian Civil Rights Act of 1968, which is oftentimes viewed as important to, it's viewed as important to Native Americans and sovereignty and rights. On the one hand, because, the Bill of Rights did not necessarily apply to the reservations prior to this, but on the same hand, you are kind of enforcing an American Bill of Rights on Native lands. So that's kind of they're viewed as pros and cons to this act. But at any rate, what did it do? It made tribal governments recognize citizens' rights, their citizens' rights to the First, Fourth, and Eighth Amendments, basically coming out and saying, okay, there are certain rights that are enshrined in the national and state bills of rights that the tribal governments have to recognize as well. But this doesn't end it. It doesn't end it. The story doesn't end there. It used to be believed that Native American history ended in 1890. It ended with First Wounded Knee. It ended with the surrender of Chief Joseph. With the defeat of Geronimo. It's not true. Still a lot happening in Native American communities today. Revitalization of cultural traditions and languages and music and art form. You've got congressional legislation, 1970s, 1980s. For example, in 1975, Congress passes the Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act, which extended support of federal support to Native American education. It gave tribal government a greater role in the actual education of their children. You've had other Supreme Court cases like Morton versus Minkari in 1974, which recognized the right of the federal government to give preference to Native Americans when it comes to um, federal agencies that service Native American people. You have Santa Clara Pueblo versus Martinez that extended additional court protections from the Indian Bill of Rights to different tribal governments. Uh, we've had congressional laws that now protect Native American artifacts and remains. That's been instrumental in the return of sacred items to Native American peoples, and that keep, you know, archaeologists, whether amateur or professional, or other people from going up and digging up Native American burial sites, and that grants protection to any of these sites in the event that they're uncovered, like say during a construction project. Yeah, so a lot of stuff that's still going on today that Native Americans continue to use in the struggle for maintaining their communities and for developing communities that connect them and give them meaning in the modern 21st century.